Good evening and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a special edition of Oxnard Live. I'm your host, Daniel Chavez Jr. Tonight, we are speaking with candidate for District 3 and author of measures F, L, M, and N, Mr. Aaron Starr. A little bit of background about him. He's a lifelong resident of Ventura County and grew up in a working class family. Father was a supermarket pharmacist and mother was a nurse at Kaiser Hospital. He worked to put himself through college, earned a degree in accounting and finance from Cal State Northridge, and is a business leader as a financial controller at Haas Automation. He also is the founder and president of Moving Oxnard Forward, a local community organization dedicated to improving our city's economy and quality of life. He is also the financial manager of the Gene Haas Foundation that donates millions to local charities in Oxnard and the communities. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Aaron Starr. Aaron?
Right, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. How are you?
I'm doing well. Great to see you.
Good to see you too. It's been a while, but you have sure been busy since the last time we've seen each other.
You can say that.
But that's always good though. We gotta stay busy as here in Oxnard. So let's get started with it. You are running for office again for District 3, which is the La Colonia, Rose Park, East Village area. And you actually have 4 measures on the ballot this year. So We're gonna talk about both sides, but first I wanna actually talk about your candidacy and what actually motivated you to run for City Council in District 3.
Sure. Well, basically, I watch City Hall and what they do, and they don't seem to get a whole lot done. It seems like the City Council is mostly of going in one direction, and they're spending a lot of money but not getting a lot done. And I think that. I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry about that. I was getting something else set up. Please continue.
Okay, sure. So basically, I think that the city needs to get back to focusing on the basics. And the sort of things that I support are a responsive government that's transparent, that has accountability and exercises ethics. I think we need to focus on attracting and retaining local businesses and well-paying jobs. We need to do the basics like fix the streets and alleys. We need to clean up parks, roadways, and public landscaping. We need to protect health and safety. We need to address homelessness, and we need to work with the school district, make sure we have better education for our children. So those are sort of the basics that I think we need to really focus on. And sometimes I think our city tries to do so many things that they don't get very much done at all.
So let me ask you, this isn't your first time running for office.
Right.
What were your 3 priorities this go around?
What were my 3 priorities this go around?
Yeah, because again, we can name 100 different priorities in the city of Oxnard, but I only want to focus on 3 that you believe that are the utmost important, that if you're elected to office, the 3 that you're really going to focus and push to try to get across that finish line.
Transparency is real important to me, because if you don't have transparency, especially with how the money is spent, you're never going to really spend it wisely. So that's number 1. Number 2, we need to really focus on the basics like fixing the roads and infrastructure and that sort of thing. And number 3, we need to really bring in more businesses into town. We have a real severe problem with, we could have more revenues in our city if we just don't chase away businesses. So instead of taxing people to death, we need to figure out ways to get more businesses into town so that we can bring in more higher paying jobs, so we can bring in the more property tax and sales tax. And one of the nice things about that is if you bring in more higher paying jobs, typically the people that have jobs are the ones that have, they voice fewer demands on City Hall for services. So it's really difficult when you have a city with as high of an unemployment and poverty rate as we do. You have a combination of high demand for services and low revenues at the same time. So we're really out of balance, and it's one of those things where you can't tax yourself out of that problem.
So this is actually, when you ran for office before, it was an at-large system.
Right.
There was no districts, but this is the first time that you're actually participating in a district election, and this is actually the second district election that the city is having. What have you seen to be the challenges now, from an at-large to district, as in terms of running your campaign?
In terms of running the campaign, well, I think it's simpler, but for the most part, people throughout Oxnard have the same sort of needs. I mean, sure, I think there are some areas of the city that are more neglected than others. You've got different issues that are more of a focus, let's say, like on the, near District 1, I think the harbor is probably a bigger issue, for example. In the south, the streets are really, really bad, even worse than here. So, just being underserved is a real problem over there. But the district where I'm in, which is in the northeast corner, still has many of the same issues where we need to have the streets repaired. We need to have businesses coming into town. Trees being trimmed, landscaping are issues. Just garbage everywhere. So I don't know if it's a lot different. I mean, clearly you have to be focused a little bit on what the local needs are. We have like a large high school that's going to be built, and the problem is I think there's going to be over 1,000 homes, if I'm not mistaken, in a very small area. And unfortunately, there's inadequate parking, and you're going to have a spillover effect into nearby neighborhoods with this high density housing. And that's a problem of just either poor planning or perhaps just not caring about the impact on other people.
So let me ask you, because we have seen throughout the city, like you mentioned, parts of South Oxnard have a real issue when it comes to parking. And Colonia, Rose Park area also has that very same problem where parking is an issue. You got people blocking spaces with trash cans and cones, and it's just a big old thing. And now a new housing development is going into the farmland that's right there. Mm-hmm. Do you have any plans or ideas on how you can actually maybe create something so that parking is not such a big issue?
Oh, sure. I mean, for one, let's say this to begin with. And any development that comes into this town needs to provide a sufficient number of parking. Otherwise, they're causing what's called a negative externality on others, right? They're putting their burden on other people, and any development should absorb its own burden. But what we're witnessing, though, is a problem where whenever you have common ownership of any good, well, everybody wants to make use of it, right? So one solution is to allow people to own the spot right in front of their house, and that's their parking spot. And that way no one else can park there. So when you've got a location that opens up, and let's say it's an apartment complex, and they've only got 10 spots, well, if they don't have any spots nearby to park in because it's owned by the neighborhood houses, well, at that point, when you're moving into that apartment complex, you should know right away that you're probably not going to have a car coming with you, or you're going to have to make other arrangements for where your car is going to be parked. But I find that private ownership solves a lot of these problems where you have this problem where everyone wants to make use of a commonly owned area.
So what do you say to those families? Because we live in a very blue collar community. Everyone's very hardworking in the city of Oxnard. And a single vehicle to a home is not a very common thing. So they may have 2 vehicles, they may even have 3 vehicles if they have children. What happens then? And the home doesn't have a driveway.
Right. Well, what I find with at least many homes, and maybe not the homes that you're talking about, but in many places, you'd be surprised how many people don't park in their own garages because they use the garages for storage space. So So that's a problem. I think that, but once you've got a spot that's privately owned, a parking spot, then you can make a decision. Do you want to use that spot? Do you want to rent that spot out to somebody else who wants to use it for their car? These sorts of, supply and demand, um, and competition for spots, you typically get a better outcome in the end. Whoever really, really wants a car is going to pay for that privilege. Right now, everybody has a car and everyone else has to bear the burden of your car. But, there's been a lot of talk over the years about trying to encourage people to go away from their cars. Well, they won't do that as long as they have a guarantee, as long as they think they've got a pretty good shot of parking just about anywhere they want. But once you make it so that they have to get their own spot somewhere in order to park, well, that changes the calculus, and maybe more people will be using Uber instead, or making other arrangements that will make it so that parking is not impossible.
So we're going to wrap up this part, but let me ask you a couple more questions. Say you make it to the city council, and now you are representing the residents of District 3 as well as the city as a whole. What are your first actions that you're going to try to take as the newly elected city council member from District 3?
Well, I find that, first of all, you spend a lot of time listening, because whenever you get into a situation, there's always a lot of information under the surface that you don't know about going in. So I assume there'll be quite a few closed sessions where there's a discussion of what the open legal issues are. But basically what I'd like to do is certainly have more of an opportunity to see what's going on as far as the actual spending goes. I mean, that's kind of my wheelhouse, is trying to understand where the spending is, how it's being spent, and can it be spent more efficiently. So I think I'd like to do more of a deep dive there. And the sort of analysis I like to do is I'd like to compare our cities with other cities. Start off with a high level, notice where there's some disparities, and then peel the onion away, one layer at a time till you find the answer. So just asking a lot of questions is where you start off with. And I think that's what you need more than anybody else who comes into office, is you need somebody who's able and willing to ask intelligent questions. And don't assume that anybody coming in has all the answers, because typically you don't. Once you get in there, you discover a lot that you didn't know coming in. But if you ask intelligent questions, and if you're able to question the information that's given to you and do follow-up questions, you're going to wind up with better policy outcomes.
Sounds good, Aaron. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the measures. You have placed 4 measures on the ballot, measures F, L, M, and N. And each one is to tackle deficiencies in the city that you feel that need to be addressed. So the first measure is measure F, which is permit simplicity.
Right.
And you believe that this is going to be able to assist the city in bringing in high-paying jobs,
Right.
may end the black market of illegal construction.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about that.
So basically, this is an idea that wasn't invented here. It was invented in Phoenix, Arizona. And Phoenix is the 5th most populous city in the country. So it's not a small time experiment. They've been doing it for over 10 years. I mean, currently we have a pretty dysfunctional system at City Hall today when it comes to permitting. When I spoke to the city manager about it, he said he actually had more complaints about that than he did about homeless people, which kind of surprised him, because out in Riverside, I think it was probably a bit different. But right now we have a dysfunctional system. We have many horror stories that you hear about. I know of one church, for example, where it took them over 2 years to get all the permits to be able to build a new church. I know of another church. It turns out that they had a building there, and it took them years to get a permit just to pave their parking lot. And sometimes what happens is that you've got, and unfortunately, you got instances where people are trying to get permits or being asked for donations to support various city programs. Kind of the implication being that this might help you get your permit faster. And that comes across as pretty corrupt to me. I've ran into contractors and architects who say they will not do business in Oxnard just because it's too difficult to do it. So, we need to fix those sorts of problems. So what permit simplicity does is, now keep in mind that just because you have an approved plan doesn't mean that you have a safe building, right? Because what needs to happen is it needs to be built safely. What happens sometimes is that after you set of plans, sometimes the people that are actually doing the construction are not constructing according to plan. And we need to have, better inspections going on. So right now, the resources, I think, at City Hall need to be diverted to, instead of in the front end, where we should instead rely more on the architects and the civil engineers and have the proper reviews and peer reviews and audits. But by doing that, we can free up more resources at City Hall to get into the inspection phase. Because even the city admits, with their own fire stations, which certainly went through their own permitting system, they say that they're not up to code, and that there's problems with them. So, the city wants to give this message out here that somehow that what Phoenix has done is not safe. But you'll never hear stories about buildings falling down in Phoenix. It just doesn't happen. But right now we have this black market in construction, that you hear about, people doing, doing tenant improvements without permits. You've got people, making changes to their houses without permits because they don't want to go through the system, and that makes it more dangerous. Candidly, you do want a system where you have some oversight, and you don't want to drive all this activity underground. The other issue is that right now employers don't want to expand here, and they don't want to come here. When my company, Haas Automation, came to town back in the mid 90s, like right around 95, 96, we were in Chatsworth, and we were busting out of the walls. We wanted to expand. We couldn't get through the bureaucracy at Los Angeles, City Hall. So we had to start looking elsewhere. So we were approaching other cities, and some cities were approaching us. We were talking to Valencia and Lancaster and Palmdale, and they were offering us various incentives to come to their cities. They were offering us free land and buildings, and the cost for the building and finance, everything you could imagine. And then we had a conversation with Oxnard. And I think at the time we had, and this was before I joined the company, but what I was told by at the time was that we had like the city mayor, one of the city council members, we had the person in charge of the planning department, we had the city manager visit us, and we said to them, well, what are you going to give to us? And they said, we'll get your plans for the building department in 2 weeks. And we said, sold. That's all we wanted. So we actually got it in about 3.5 weeks. But from the time we submitted plans to the time that we had a 400,000 square foot building built with a certificate of occupancy, took us only 10 months. And we hired 400 people instantly, pretty much, here in the community. And now we have over 1 million square feet today in Oxnard. We have over 1,400 employees. And my hope is that by putting in permit simplicity, that we can bring in dozens of companies like mine, so that we can bring in higher paying local jobs, so that we can bring more revenues. It increases the sales and use tax revenues, the property tax revenues. It is a better solution in the long run than just taxing ourselves to death. So I mean, the way this program works is that you have architects and civil engineers. They'll go through a program at City Hall where they get training about exactly what the city expects to see when all the paperwork is submitted. All the pre-approvals that need to be done, all the boxes need to be checked. So they bring their plans in, and if everything is there, then they get their permit in 1 day. But one of the things that the city would be requiring is that if anything has say a load-bearing wall, they need to have another civil engineer, not just the one that's hired, do peer review. And that civil engineer is actually chosen by the city. So they used to be approved civil engineer by the state. So basically you have all those protections. So what Measure F does not do is it doesn't change the zoning laws. It doesn't change the building codes. You have to meet all those health and safety laws. You still have field inspections. You still have, you have your audits. So it's really a very good system that has 10 years of experience. And one thing that the city can do is if for some reason, because of an audit or because of a field inspection, there's a problem, they can yank the permit. And they can even do their audit before, if they're working fast at it, even before the construction begins. So, and what you're going to find, at least the experience in Phoenix has been the case, when you do not want to fail an audit, because the reason for that is that you get ejected from the program if it's egregious enough or if it's enough times. And if you're an architect or a civil engineer, that just kills your business in Phoenix, because all your competitors can get done in one day what's going to take you months and months to do. So it's a self-policing system where people have every incentive in the world to make sure they're doing a good job, because they don't want to lose that opportunity to get through the system quickly. So, our vision here is that if we do this right, we're going to attract higher paying jobs into our community. Somebody who wants to open up in this community is not going to have to wait 2 years to get a permit or be afraid that they'll never get a permit at all. There's nothing worse for a business than to buy a piece of land, spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in architectural plans, and ultimately just get denied. No one wants that level of uncertainty. And we were happy to have some assurance when we moved our company to Oxnard that we were going to get through the system, that everything was going to be accommodative for us and make it happen. The challenge is that, of course, they wouldn't do that for a small business, and they ought to. And small businesses are just as important as big businesses, and I would argue even more so, because they're the most nimble and they have the most growth opportunities. So I say, let's do this. Let's increase our city revenues. Let's make it easier for the public to improve their own homes. Let's improve public safety by having fewer projects go through the black market. Let's free up resources for inspections. It's just a really good program, and it's unfortunate that City Hall doesn't want to embrace this. So that's
I'm sorry, Aaron, but let me ask you. You mentioned the cities of Elkwood, Rancho Cordova, and Phoenix that all have this program or a similar program to what you're proposing with Measure F, correct?
So our program is more extensive than what we have in California today. It's more equivalent to Phoenix and actually goes even a little bit further than Phoenix does. We have the opportunity to differentiate ourselves from pretty much any other city around.
So I watched, now it's 2 weeks ago, the forum with INCO, where you gave your presentation and you made mention of Elk Grove and how you and your wife went up there, got the packet. So I actually contacted Elk Grove also, and I asked them about their program. And they said that their program started back in 2015, and since then they only had one person actually take advantage of it.
Well, that seems really strange, because the person that we were talking to was talking about the program, gave us a copy of their program, all the rules, the regulations. But one thing we did notice from talking to the folks is that they actually do get their projects through quickly up in Elk Grove and Rancho Cordova. So when you think about it, in order to, if you're an architect or civil engineer, if you've got a system that works, there's no reason why you'd have to go through all the training and all that in order to qualify for a program like that. And certainly up in the Northern California area, they're really dealing more with the smaller projects, like typically tenant improvements. Whereas if you look at Phoenix, they're dealing with much, much bigger projects. And it becomes very worthwhile to go through the training of that. You also have issues where, you still have the bureaucracy that wants to slow things down and discourage, going through this process. Whereas in Phoenix, for example, they had a city council that was really committed to making this happen. Here, if we actually have the voters that voted in, it's going to be pretty solid at that point. It's not like the bureaucracy or the council can overturn it. But I will mention that the way our initiative is written, we actually do give the city council the ability to modify the program. So it's not like it's stuck in concrete. So as long as any adjustments or modification made to the program still fulfills the purposes and intent that is in the measure, which is that they want to be able to get a permit out in a day.
So let me ask you, because you are aware that we are in COVID season and cities across the nation have been hit horrible with this. Now many cities, including Oxnard, is dipping into the reserves. How much is Measure F going to cost the city as far as developing a training program, the staff required to do that, advertising this permits of plenty, and additional add-ons? How much would this end up costing the city?
Well, that's a good question. Don't know the answer to that yet, but I can tell you this, that one of the programs that is offered in the initiative is put on by I think it's the Economic Growth Institute. So if they want to actually use an existing out-of-the-box training program, they can take advantage of that. My suspicion is that the city may want to go in a slightly different direction and certainly take that approach instead. But we've given them several different ways to do this. So there's some flexibility to how the program can be developed. And yeah, keep your eye on the big picture. The big picture is how do you get a lot more businesses into town? And yeah, I imagine there's going to be some upfront costs, but any new program has new upfront costs. I mean, the city of Phoenix had upfront costs when they developed their program, and it worked out really well for them. So it's no different than any other economic development program by the city. Think about it this way. We do spend efforts trying to attract businesses into town, and that costs money. And cities do that for a reason. They invest that type of money to bring those new businesses into town. Think of this as an investment in our economic development program.
So as far as Oxnard being, and you pointed this out over the past few years that I've known you, that our city is financially broken, in the lack of a better words. So where do we get the money when we're already financially strapped to be able to develop this program and invest in this to bring in these large businesses into the city of Oxnard?
Well, remember, just even getting one large business will pay itself off all by itself. I mean, right now we lost a business a while back. Amazon wanted to come here, and we actually had copies of the emails that was going through City Hall about it. They had a code name for it. It was called Project Gaucho, but we were able to figure out what it really was. They wanted to do a 2+ million square foot facility on Del Norte near the freeway there. And it was going to bring in about 2,000 or 2,100 jobs or something like that at various levels of pay. And that would have been an absolute boon to the local economy there. There would have been so many opportunities. The revenues would have been great coming in. But basically, City Hall made it impossible. One of the challenges that you have when you work with the folks at the desk, at the counter, when it comes to getting permits, is that you typically get different answers depending on who you talk to. And sometimes what you'll find is that they put in requirements that have nothing to do with the building code. I mean, they'll tell you, you know what, can you do this with Spanish tile instead? I mean, we even saw that with Amazon where they didn't like, I think the layout or the front of their building, and they're saying, can you change this? And they're saying, is there something in the building code somewhere that says that we have to do that? But so the problem is that, unfortunately, when you don't have written rules down to follow, you wind up with a system that ends up being arbitrary and capricious. And, the folks, unfortunately, at City Hall don't really have skin in the game often to, making it a successful outcome, because they have their jobs, whether they get it done or not.
So let me ask you, because there is some confusion about Measure F, that people believe that this is a self-certification. You mentioned in the INCO forum that it's not a self-certification, that it's actually a peer review. Can you explain a little bit more what exactly a peer review is versus what a self-certification is?
So, self-certification in its pure sense would be, well, first of all, there's no applicant that can come in and by themselves self-certify. You need to first have somebody who has a licensed architect or licensed civil engineer who's had a license for over 5 years. They have to have their license on the line. They have to insure the city. They have to name the city in their insurance policy. So they provide protection like that. So you don't have the applicant self-certifying. In addition, if you have a type of project that doesn't involve a safety issue, like let's say, I don't know, landscaping. Yeah. Unless you believe someone's going to fall into a hole in the ground, it should be pretty simple to have somebody who has expertise in landscaping to be able to self-certify. But when you get something that involves, where you need a civil engineer or a soils engineer, whenever you have a situation where you have the potential for a building that you don't have a situation where a building can fall down, right? So that's why you have the peer review. So this goes beyond self-certification, because the city will have a group of civil engineers that they approve of who can do the peer review. And it's only with that peer review, in addition to the civil engineer that the applicant hired, unless they agree, it's not even going to City Hall for the permit. So it's kind of a misnomer to say this is some pure self-certification process. It's just simply not.
Now, insurance rates. Obviously, they're going to go up now that they're going to be again, I just want to make it real clear that it's an optional program, that in no way, shape, or form is it mandatory for people to participate in the program. But right, those that participate are going to end up seeing higher insurance rates for whatever project or permit that they submit for, correct?
So basically, if an architect or civil engineer wants to be part of this process where they can get a permit done in a day, if their carrier requires higher rates, and there's no certainty of that, by the way, it really depends on their history of litigation, right? But if there is some additional insurance, well, that's something that they're willing to pay for. And it's also saying the applicant is willing to pay a little more to this architect or civil engineer for, the benefit of having their project go through quickly. I mean, just imagine you getting something done in one day instead of going back and forth for, 4 months, 6 months or longer, is worth a lot of money to an applicant. When I was talking to architects about this, they were describing something called 80% plans. Have you ever heard of that term? So here's what an 80% plan is. Architects know that you never give the building department your best stuff, because they know that no matter what, in order for them to feel like they have something in the process, they're going to red mark it anyway. So they purposely submit a set of plans that's not complete, so that the building official can then mark something up, send it back to them, so then they can make some changes. That's what used to happen in Phoenix before permit simplicity. Now what happens is that they go in with 100% ready plans, because they know that they're going to very quickly go right out into the field with those plans and actually start getting to work. So
let me ask you, what do you say to those that feel that this is actually another layer of bureaucracy? You're now, to participate in this program, you have to go through a training that's put on by the city, which really confuses me, because you already said that the city has problems, but now they're going to train others as to what they're looking for. But you also made comment that you can get 3, 4, 5 different answers from multiple people. What do you say to those that just feel it's another level of bureaucracy that could potentially just slow things down even more than the old way?
It'll probably speed things up because what will happen is that the city has to come up with a standard checklist. And when you have a system today where it just seems to be that the requirements that are imposed on you are almost random, this is part of the reason why you have these poor outcomes at City Hall. Nobody really knows what's required of them. So by actually investing the time to come up with a standard checklist, there'll actually be benefit for those folks who don't go through the permit simplicity program. Because if the city is bright about this, they're going to leverage that checklist and be able to use it for even folks that don't go through that system. So we really have an opportunity to streamline bureaucracy and make it quicker. Now, city manager's trying to do his own approach, and that's fine, and I hope he succeeds. But here I am seeing something that's an optional, workable program that works elsewhere. We're not inventing anything really new here. And it seems like people like it.
So why not start off slow and then build up into it? Start off with, re-roofing or a water heater before actually saying you can build a whole building or, make modifications. Why not start off small and then build onto it?
Well, for one, it probably will wind up being that way anyway, because what happens is that it's going to take time for the city to certify a list of civil engineers that will be able to provide the peer review. So as the city starts developing this program, and it's not like a light switch where the voters voted this in and 10 days later you got a program, right? So the city is likely to start off with simple tenant improvements and other tasks that have to go through the building department while they develop the training for those folks who can ultimately be able to be civil engineers that can be added to their list. So the reality is it will take time. And it wouldn't surprise me if it takes a year or two to fully get to where they need to be. So there'll be plenty of opportunity to develop the program over time.
All right, Aaron. So thank you for those comments and answering the questions. Moving on to Measure L. Now, this is, in a lack of a better words, it's ultimately merging the city treasurer and the chief financial officer, the CFO position, into one elected position. Please, provide your comments on that.
So it's kind of interesting that the city manager even focused on that aspect of it, because to me, the bigger aspect of the whole measure was the transparency of it. I mean, that's why we called it the Oxnard Fiscal Transparency and Accountability Act. So it requires that the city provide more information to the public. It requires that they put every invoice, every purchase order, every requisition, every bid, every solicitation for a bid online, so that people can see where the money is actually going and how well is the city doing when it comes to purchasing for their own needs. It also requires that there be monthly financial statements. So that way it's possible for even the city council to see in an intelligent way where the money is going and for the public to see where the money is going. It's the problem with the existing financial statements we have now is that you only get them 6 months pretty much after the end of a year because it takes time to do the audit. And by then you've got data that's as old as 18 months, right? Because you have 12 months plus 6. You can't run a business that way. You can't run any operation that way, especially one the size of Oxnard. I was surprised to learn that they don't have monthly financial statements to begin with. So this is going to require that they provide timely information to decision makers. The other issue is that the city's operations are really inefficient, or you can't tell how efficient they are because there's no measurements. And in management, they say that you get what you measure. If you're not measuring it, people aren't performing because people want to meet the measurements. So we've come up with 3 different categories of measurements for each department. Well, actually, so the categories are based on cost, it's based on quality, and based on timeliness. So why do we pick those three? It's because they're in contention with each other, right? Because you can get something that's cheap and you can get something that may be high quality, but it's going to take you forever to get it, right? Or you can get something that is, let's say, cheap and quick, but it won't be high quality. Or you can get something that's, quick and high quality, but it may be really costly. So since these three different ways of viewing output are in contention with each other, having those three different categories of measurements is really important. So you need somebody who actually will develop the metrics for each of these departments. And we've decided that the CFO needs to do that, and that those measurements be posted online. The city council can require additional metrics beyond what the CFO requires. We've also had lots of problems at City Hall when it comes to our finances. I mean, the city manager likes to talk about how, hey, we have no new findings. Okay, you have a bunch of existing findings. And, when you've got 3 or 4 findings with an audit, that's horrendously horrible. I mean, it is the worst. So it's just strange that we talk about having these findings that are existing in as if that's somehow approaching normal. And there's nothing normal about that. It is just a terrible fail. I mean, it was putting us in a category of like Bell, California. So we've had huge problems that sit in the finance department where we've had, turnover. We've had 6 CFOs in 10 years. We've had a history of malfeasance going on where, for example, we had a city manager at one point that was giving out benefits to employees that weren't approved by the city council, and no one had visibility of it. And the problem is that you've got all this power and accountability in one person, the city manager. Everybody answers to him. So there's no way, and he likes to talk about how he's got this team. That's how he likes to describe it, that he's not alone. You know what? I call that for what it is. It's nonsense. Because at the end of the day, if they don't do what he wants, guess what's going to happen? Their jobs are bye-bye. So when you've got all this power where the city manager controls the information flow to the city council, and of course, he's going to send them information saying, I'm doing a great job. He's not going to provide them with the information of where he failed. He's going to override internal controls. A lot of internal controls are not like a computer stopping you from doing something. You've got processes that you're relying on human beings to implement. So you might have a process that says that you need to have approval by these certain parties before you can go for a sole source bid. Well, guess what? If the city manager says, hey, I don't want to do a sole source bid, what are they going to do? They're going to tell them no? No, they're going to say, yes, sir. Yes, sir. We'll do exactly what you want, sir. So you don't have checks and balances, really. And the city manager can also fire, anybody who's a whistleblower, you can fire them too. So the problem is that when you don't have checks and balances, I could put in this wonderful system or wonderful requirement, but there's nobody who really owns it, who says that I'm going to do this and I'm going to be held accountable for it. Because if the city manager wants to drag his feet and not provide the transparency, well, guess what? You're not going to get the transparency. But by having an elected official tasked with all of these requirements and dividing up the responsibility so you have proper separation of duties, you're going to have a system that has better controls. You're going to have a system that makes it more difficult for any one person to engage in malfeasance. So that's why we ended up breaking up the tasks in various ways. City council will be hiring the city manager like they do now. It's the voters that hire the CFO. And I just love how the city manager is going after, imagine we're going to have some 18-year-old. That's just nonsense. one of the things, and by the way, we thought about this when we were writing the initiative. We said, can we put in requirements for, that would be nice, but it looks like state law occupies this area. And if we were a charter city, maybe we can put in requirements, but I'm not so certain that we can do that as a general law city. So to be safer, what I did instead is I made the requirement that we hire one or more CPAs on staff. So even if you had somebody who wasn't the greatest, financial guy in the world, because the entire department is hired by the city manager, with the exception of the CFO at this point, if our measure goes through, you have pretty good confidence that you're going to have some pretty good, capable people hired, right? Because, let's face it, I'm the controller of my company. Do you think I actually do the accounts payable entries? Do you think I do all the journal entries? I mean, we've got people who do that. And, I'm here to be a manager in my role. I'm not doing the everyday. I mean, last I looked, like the finance departments and treasurer departments combined had several dozen people. So it's not like you got this one lone guy, this one, gunslinger out there. And typically when the voters vote for somebody in this position, what are they looking at? They're looking at the person's occupation on the ballot designation. So if somebody says, on their ballot designation, I'm a homeless person, they're probably not going to get the vote. If somebody says, if somebody has a background that's other than finance or accounting or banking, you can pretty much guarantee they're not going to get the vote. And because that position is going to pay, a 6-digit salary, it's not like you've got people who aren't qualified in Oxnard who can do this job. Now, me personally, I don't want it. I work for a great company, but there are plenty of qualified people in Oxnard who have the financial background. We have a history of electing people with a financial background. You've got cities up and down the state who have elected treasurers. There's over 170 of them. And I don't think I could point to one ever that was an 18-year-old getting elected to that position. So the city manager wants to put out a red herring, and more power to him, I guess. It's a nice way of trying to fool the public. So the other thing that the city manager argues is that somehow this super finance guy is going to have control of the budget. It doesn't work that way. Right now, the city manager proposes a budget, but guess who adopts it or modifies it? City council. So it's going to be the same thing it'll be the same thing after this initiative. Instead of the city manager, though, it's going to be the CFO. They'll be proposing it.
Let me ask you, Aaron, do you still believe that there's still malfeasance occurring in city government, and in particular the city manager's office?
The problem when you don't have adequate controls is that you'll never find out, because these sorts of things get swept under the rug. So you hear stories, but they're stories. And I have to put them into the category of rumor until somebody gives me evidence. But if you don't have a system that detects malfeasance, you will never see malfeasance, even if it goes on.
And I only ask that because you referred to a city manager, and this was Ed Sotelo, that hadn't worked for the city since 2012. And in between 2012 until now, we have had 3 interims and then 2 city managers, and including our current city manager. So that's why I asked if you believe that there's still some type of malfeasance still occurring, even though you already mentioned that we have gone through 6 CFOs over a 10-year period. Again, that was between Ed Sotelo, Greg Nyhoff, our current city manager, and even interim city managers. And so that's why I asked that question, if you still believe that there's still malfeasance still occurring in City Hall. Because ultimately what I see from when I first started getting involved with the city 5 years ago, it's a whole new executive team. So do you still believe that there is still, for lack of a
Well,
better word, leeches of
let, let,
malfeasance?
let me put it this way. I do wonder why some of them leave and they're really uncomfortable and they don't want to talk about it. So take that for what it is. Um, it's difficult when your future career can be based on what you say after you leave a place. So I've I've had conversations with, and I don't want to out anybody, but I'll tell you that I had one conversation with a manager who discovered that cash was being diverted and pocketed. Now, he is a good manager and he fixed it. But not every manager is on top of these things. I don't want to say a whole lot more than that because I don't want to cause problems for him because, yeah, or her. So anyway, things can be better at City Hall, and it's never a problem to put in a better system of internal controls. And that's what this ordinance requires. It requires that the CFO put together a system of internal controls. It requires that if the city council wants additional controls, they can put some on too, which you want to have that ability because you also you don't want the issue of, let's say, a bad CFO either, right? So we have sort of the same sort of issue with, say, cities where they have elected mayors who are strong mayors, or you don't have a city manager. You've got that type of same sort of issue where you could have somebody that has a lot of power and you want there to be checks and balances, and good cities put in those checks and balances. So I see that's kind of the equivalent of having a CFO that's elected. You want the ability to put in additional controls, which the city council will be allowed to do, because they're the ones that are going to still continue to hire the outside external auditor. It's the CFO that'll be handling the internal auditor. And the city council can require that the internal auditor investigate the CFO even. So we were pretty careful about putting this together to make sure that everybody is a check on everybody else. But right now, what you've got at City Hall is nobody's a check, really. You've got a city manager that controls everything. In theory, he's reviewed by the city council. He says he can be fired by them at any time. But you know what? All the information that they get is filtered through the city manager. And everybody who could blow the whistle answers to the city manager. It's really an untenable situation if you want to have a system where you want a system of internal controls because you're far less likely to have malfeasance.
So Aaron, let me ask you, you say that too much power in one person's hands is too much, but ultimately what you're doing is you're taking all those finances and putting it into an elected CFO. Now, you also made mention that—
Hold on. Don't stop there. Today, we have everything under the appointed city manager. Everything. What this does is it divides it up. So now everything is not under the city manager.
Correct. And everything's going to be under the elected CFO. Or did I misunderstand you?
You got to remember, when you've got a city manager, he still hires everybody that works for the CFO. So, if the CFO was hiring everybody, okay, I think you'd have a good point. But that's not what you have here. The city manager actually hires all those people. And if there was a problem going on in that department, far more likely under that circumstance that someone's going to raise their hand and say, I've got a problem here. Because the CFO doesn't have the ability to hire and fire the people that are under him.
Correct. And so I just want to clarify.
Sure.
You're saying that I'm wrong for saying that all of the city's finances being under one person is not true. Or am I correct?
You have a person who supervises the department. but he doesn't control everything about it.
Explain, please.
Well, first of all, he still only proposes the budget. He doesn't have a budget that he can put in by edict. So since the city council adopts the budget and can change the budget, he can't go around, making choices about how that money is spent. In fact, right now, he doesn't have choices. Even under our system, he doesn't control how the money is spent. The money is spent by the city manager. He's the one that directs where the money is spent.
Okay, so last week we had Alex on with us, and he said that he relies on his team, the executive team, in the respective fields to bring in information to determine how the budget is spent. Now, you're saying that under Measure L, the CFO, the elected CFO, would not have the discretion of saying this is what to propose how the money is spent. So what is the CFO's ultimate duty then?
I guess I don't understand your question.
I guess what I'm trying to figure out is that under the current system, the city manager is the one that works with the executive team to determine how the money is spent, presents it to the city council. City council either approves it as is or makes modification, then approves the budget once it comes back. The CFO under your measure is an elected position that oversees hired staff, but you made mention that he or she does not get to ultimately determine how that money is spent. So what is their role when it comes to budget month in June?
What does the city manager's role?
The CFO's role.
What's the CFO's role as far as the budget goes?
Correct. When under your measure, under Measure L, what is their role? Because I already outlined what the city manager does under this current system, that he works with the executive team.
So what a smart CFO is going to do is he's certainly going to be talking to all the department heads. He's going to be talking to the city manager and finding out what their priorities are and what he thinks the council's priorities are. Because at the end of the day, if let's just say, for example, the CFO does something nuts and comes up with a budget that says all the money is going to be spent for just the finance department. There'll be no money for anything else in the entire city. That's it. Well, guess what? That's not going to fly. The city manager is going to go to the city council and say, you know what? We need some money for parks. We need some money for police. And he's going to be, he has all the ability to, in fact, he even says in one of his reports that he can hire additional people if he wanted to come up with an additional budget. I don't think that's a wise way to go about it, but if he felt like he absolutely needed to, he could. But what you want is a somewhat cooperative relationship with the CFO and the city manager, which is one of the reasons why our measure requires that on a monthly basis, there's a report on what's the cooperation level between those parties. So just the idea that the CFO is going to operate in a complete vacuum is just bunk, for the same reason the city manager doesn't operate in a complete background. But you still don't want a situation where everything is under the city manager, which is what you have today. You want to break it up.
So let me ask you, back in March, the residents of Oxnard voted overwhelmingly, over 76%, I think it was even up to 82% for Measure B, which was Oxnard's Accountability Act.
Sure.
And a few of the things in there was to post monthly financial reportings on the city's website. How does Measure L either work or go against or supersedes as far as level of transparency to Measure B?
So what the city puts out today is like a data dump. They don't provide any sort of real information that people use. Now, when I think of a financial statement, I think of something like a balance sheet that says, here's my assets, here's my liabilities, here's my net worth. I think of a statement of activities that says, here's what the revenue that came in, here's the expenses in the various categories, here's how it compares to budget, here's my forecasts about what's going to happen in the upcoming months. Our What's going to happen is that with our proposal, there's going to be real, robust financial statements. We require that there's be a separate listing of any item that was over $10,000 would be separately reported there, so people can see that. So, Measure B only addresses the major funds too. It doesn't address all of them. Ours addresses everything.
So, okay, the CFO, they're ultimately the city treasurer, right? It's the same position, right? Now, are they going under the title of city treasurer or CFO? And I know that's petty, but
I guess I don't care.
okay. So I just want to, understand that they're the same ones and they're not two separate elected positions. But you made mention that it being elected, that it has a greater responsibility of transparency to the voters, to the residents of Oxnard. Am I
It
right?
makes it certainly more evident. It makes it more evident when the job's not being done. The problem with the city council today is that, they're not candidly all that interested. The type of person that gets elected, mayor, is not really interested in issues like wastewater systems or financial system. I mean, they're more interested in doing the next ribbon cutting at the next opening of a dog park. I'm sorry, that's just kind of the way it is. So you want somebody who is elected to that position, who has a focus in that area, who has the expert, who has that background in that area. And that's the type of person the voters will put in. Because when they see the words elected city treasurer, they're going to vote in or hire, if you will, somebody with a background in accounting or banking or finance.
Now, a couple of questions and then we're going to move on. But you made a comment that under the current system, the city manager can fire a whistleblower.
Yep.
Isn't there protections against doing that? And the city will ultimately open itself to liability and legal challenges?
Yeah, there's theory and there's real world.
Okay. Next question is, you claim that the city manager can alter controls when presenting the budget, try to make it seem that things are a lot better than what they actually are.
Sure.
But wouldn't the elected CFO be able to do the exact same thing so that they are able to be reelected? And before you answer, let me finish. Before they are reelected, to continue to receive that six-figure salary. And I say that because of the fact that you have made comments over the years that the elected officials in Oxnard on the city council have failed the residents. Mm-hmm. And that leaves me saying, okay, if those elected officials have failed, why would an elected official to the finance department that ultimately oversees the finances of our city be any better?
Because he's much more likely to have the expertise. Because the type of person that gets elected to this position is somebody with that type of background, because the voters are going to look for someone with that background. So right away, you wind up, you've filtered the pool of people that are likely to occupy that position. As far as the CFO wanting to make himself look good, well, the best way he can look good is actually by getting the financial statements out there. And because he's not operating the entity as a whole, he's just reporting on it. It doesn't hurt the CFO to say, hey, we have a problem. If anything, he's more likely to want to report that there's a problem because it's in his interest to do so. That makes him look good. The city manager, for himself to look good, is in the exact opposite position. He doesn't want to report a problem. He's going to want to sweep something under the rug. So by having a CFO that's elected, he is absolutely incentivized to find the issues. City manager doesn't really have that at all.
Now, let me ask you, because Oxnard will be here for years after me and you are gone. And if Measure L was to pass and the city treasurer is merged with the CFO, now you have an elected treasurer
Right.
that oversees all finances in our city. Mind you that through California law, section 201, it does state that to be elected to office, you need to be 18, a
Yep.
registered voter, and a resident of that area that you are trying to represent, in this case, the city of Oxnard. But the CFO, you require a BA in financing or a related field. You need 8 years minimum of working in that field, and then 3 to 5 years in management or supervisory experience.
Right.
What was your train of thought of thinking? And I understand that you said that they can hire CPAs and that it's just not them working in it, but there's other people working in there in that department, so that it's not just one lone person. But this one lone person, I'm assuming, and please correct me if I'm wrong, has to review all of the documents and all the proposals that the staff sends up to this one person, and has to sign off certifying that it is correct, it is accurate, and that it's appropriate to be sent to the city council. Am I correct?
So remember, our proposal requires that the city hire one or more CPAs. And in fact, in the city managers, it was interesting in the city manager's report to criticize this, he actually took two different approaches, which was I thought was interesting. On the one hand, he said, gosh, you don't require anything for someone to be the elected CFO, the elected treasurer. And then another part of that same report, he criticizes that we require that somebody with a CPA background be hired in the finance department. That would be more expensive. So, it's kind of interesting to hold those 2 points of view at the same time. So anything that the CFO would screw up, other employees in that department have the incentive to inform the city manager, because it's still the city manager that hires them. You don't have that situation with the city manager today. You don't have those checks and balances. So the nice thing about our system is that if you have somebody who is an incompetent CFO, it's more likely to reach the light of day. Now, you might recall that we had a report where a former city treasurer was approving payments without reviewing documents. And the outside auditor said you should do that. And what was really strange is that the current treasurer is doing that, or was, and then he was being told he was exceeding his duties for doing that. And somehow the city talked the CPA firm into saying, well, that's not so important anymore. So it's just, there's definitely a lot of control that happens at the city manager level. And I would say it's undue influence. But having a CFO that's elected, that's going to be less of a problem. There's still going to be some contention that takes place between the CFO and the city manager, but that's a bit by design, for the same reason that you've got contention between, let's say, the presidency and Congress, or between the other branches and the courts. You want that a certain level of contention going on, because everybody is watching the others and ready to point a finger and say, hey, you're doing it wrong, or you've taken on too much control. So by having our system as proposed, we introduce that level of contention, but at the same time, we still have reporting about what level of cooperation there is. Like, let me give you an example. Let's say that the CFO thinks that we should hire more CPAs in his department. City manager is required to hire at least one, but he only hires one. The CFO can go to the city council at a meeting and say, you know what, I really want more cooperation from the city manager. I've told him this is what we need, and we'd like you to give direction. So by requiring that he actually put in a report the level of cooperation he's getting, it's more likely that the city council will be kind of like that extra check and balance and say, yeah, the city manager is, let's say, understaffing the department, let's say. CFO is in a position to report to the city council about that.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to our next measure, which is measure M. It's about open meetings and procedures. Can you go ahead and provide the comments on that one, measure M?
So the big thing about measure M is making sure that meetings are happening at reasonable times. So it used to be the case that all city council meetings typically were taking place starting at 6. Sometimes they'd have like a little bit of an earlier event, like it starts at 5, or even a little bit earlier if they have a closed session. But starting in January 2019, the city council made this decision that they're going to have this committee system, and that on alternating Tuesdays, the council meets in the evenings, and the other Tuesdays, they'll have these committees that start at either like 9 or 9:30 in the morning and run the rest of the day. And the problem is that most people, this is a working class town, and people go to work during the day. So the city manager would like to say, oh, it's not going to depress the number of people attending at all. And that was just nonsense. It's clearly evident it has. He'll tell you that, oh, but there's so many other ways that the population can interact with their council. All right, so what? They've always had that option. Now they just have less an option to actually go to a meeting and give their input directly. A lot of people don't want to write to the city council or call the city council. Some people are intimidated by that. Another issue we have is that sometimes the oral staff reports come up with new information that isn't presented until that moment. And it's really difficult for the population to be really involved and question the information that's coming out there if they don't have an opportunity to see it in advance. And there's no reason why staff couldn't record their presentations ahead of time. They have to prepare for them. The previous city manager, I don't know if this one does, but the previous city manager used to have their staff give like a dry run in front of him because he wanted to know what was going to be presented in front of the city council. It's not a big deal to record it so that people can see it at the time that they post the written staff report and at the time they put up the agenda. So if we do that, it's got a number of benefits. Number one, people get to see the information in advance. The council gets to see the information in advance. People will be able to ask questions. It means that there's less time consumed at the council meeting with a long oral presentation. And what we've seen in the past is sometimes those oral presentations are really a filibuster. The time where I saw that abused the greatest was back in January of 2016, when we had the meeting about raising the utility rates dramatically. So city staff put out this really long report that was like hours long, and it wasn't necessary. And you had all these people, you had hundreds and hundreds of people that were there, not only in the council chambers, but in overflow rooms that wanted to comment. And they were just getting angrier and angrier because they saw the same thing I saw, which was that they were being hampered in their ability to give their input. They had to go home and have dinner with their kids or get ready for work the next day. And it was just egregious what was happening there. So by recording these in advance, you really take that off the table, and you have staff's primary role is to be answering questions that the city council poses to them. And perhaps, hopefully, some members of the public will ask their own questions to the city council, which they can't ask staff directly, but at least they can put those questions out there so that the city council can ask those questions. Now, what the city manager does is when he's criticizing this proposal, he says, oh, this is crazy because we have to record this in advance and then we have to play the recording at the meeting, which is just nonsense because our proposal actually says that you don't reenact the presentation at the meeting. And in my mind, if you play the recording at the meeting, as far as I'm concerned, you're reenacting it. And you're really trying to undermine the purpose of this initiative, which is to give more time for the public to speak, more time for the deliberation that goes on, which brings up the next portion of this, which is that members of the public are sometimes limited to as little as a minute to speak. And you've been there. You know how hard it is to, especially at the last minute, be told you don't have 3 minutes now to speak. You have 1 minute, go. It's hard to come up with anything coherent in 1 minute. I mean, those of us with practice can do it, but the typical person coming to a meeting is pretty intimidated as it is. And, it's just really difficult for those folks. There's also some agenda items where the council doesn't have to hear from anybody at all, at least under state law. Now, so far they haven't taken advantage of that, but I expect they will at some point if this doesn't pass, which is that if an item comes before a committee that's made up of only council members, under the Brown Act, they can allow you to speak at that meeting, but there's no requirement that they allow you to speak at the council meeting when the full council is hearing that same item later on. So one of the things that our measure does is it fills in that loophole in state law and says, no, you get to speak even on a subject that had been discussed by the council before, but just in committee.
Okay, so you made mention that you're able to, members of the public, including the council, is allowed to have the information in advance. What does that look like? A week, a few days? The Brown Act requires a minimum of 72 hours, but Sunshine Ordinance that was introduced by current city manager, it's 12 days before the city council meeting and 7 days before a council committee meeting. So how many days in advance, or is it still the same time?
It's actually at the same time that it goes on to the agenda with the staff report is when you put out the presentation.
So, okay, so it's still following the same timeline as the Sunshine Ordinance.
Sure.
It's 12 days.
But remember, the Sunshine Ordinance is a city ordinance that the council can change if they want to. All that's required in this ordinance is that whenever it does come on the agenda and you got the staff report there, that's the same time the oral presentation should also be recorded and put in place there too. Because otherwise you're getting incomplete information. If you see only a written staff report and the oral presentation is going to have something very different later on, or some things that weren't in the written staff report, or just sometimes the oral presentation is just more clear than what's in the written staff report. You want that information available at the same time so that people can do their due diligence. So, I mean, I've had instances, and I'm sure you have too, where you've been to a council meeting. Yes, you hear something put in the oral presentation, you're going like, oh, well, I didn't realize that. That wasn't so obvious from the written report. How do I, you quickly get out your phone, you're Googling it, you're trying to figure out, well, how is that? What's the reality out there? And you're left trying to respond when staff has had weeks to prepare for this. And you don't have the ability to respond quickly and go, hey, but wait a minute. There was another staff report from 2 years ago that conflicts with your presentation now. And I want to bring that to your attention. Hard to do that when the oral presentation is being given and literally you're up next 10 minutes later trying to give a public comment.
Okay, so at no point is staff actually either being recorded or actually in person actually giving a presentation. They're just simply there for questions and additional comments, correct?
It says their primary purpose is to answer questions and answers, is to answer questions. Now, if they wanted to, they could stretch it and say, you know what, at the time that I put up my presentation, we thought we knew all the facts. Something new has happened in the last 12 days. Here's what you need to know. That happens. And that's why there's some flexibility there. So we didn't want to say, thou shalt not speak about anything other than answering questions. We didn't write it that way. But we also didn't write it to say, come to the meeting, push the play button on your recorder, and play the presentation that you recorded in advance. That would just undermine the purpose of the ordinance, and it would just be passive aggressive on the part of city staff to do something like that. So hopefully they will never do anything as abusive as that. And it's just a plain waste of time.
So city manager made a comment, and it most likely was in the staff report, that it will actually cost the city more by pre-recording the presentations. Now, can you explain how it doesn't cost the city more to pre-record these presentations? Because ultimately, you have to get the IT department involved. You're causing that staff member to stop their daily work to go and record this presentation.
So they're already spending their daily work practicing their presentation anyway. They don't come to a meeting cold, or at least they better not. So at some point, they're practicing their presentation if they want to make efficient use of the time and not waste the council's time. And it seems to me, it costs just as much to record them during the workday as it does during the evening. Right now, you've got staff who are there late at night who are recording. Are they hourly employees? Maybe. You know, you got overtime for them probably. So, you got to remember, the city manager doesn't like this. So he has every incentive in the world to try and inflate the alleged costs. And this is all really because of politics. You know, when you've got something in the staff report that says something to the effect of, well, this is kind of, you know, even though this is not likely to happen, we can imagine all these costs being incurred. And they did that with one of the reports. You know, they said, this is a cynical way of looking at it, but you know what? We can imagine the CFO not presenting a budget report. We're going to have to hire 3 people, and it's going to cost this much extra money. You know, the city manager wants to give the idea that somehow these reports he puts out are objective. He has a reason to want to convince you that he's right. And he's not the arbiter of truth here. So think about this. He has something to gain by not telling you the full story, or by telling you his story.
So let me ask you, you made a comment that...
And let me give you an example, by the way. At one point, they were talking about all these meetings that are going to happen there where it's going to be all required in the evenings. And he ignored that we have built-in exceptions. I mean, he's talking about, oh, the seniors are, you know, they're going to bed at 5 p.m. or something like that. So they can't attend. Well, you know what? The advisory committee meetings for the seniors commission, that can meet anytime it wants to, because we have a built-in exception for the meeting rules, the meeting start times. It doesn't apply to any committee that is just purely advisory nature. So any of the CAGs, you know, any, you know, the INCO, anything that doesn't actually set policy, or, you know, they can meet anytime they want. Now, something like the Planning Commission, that's different because you are making decisions, and that would have to meet in the evening. You couldn't meet in the middle of the day under this ordinance that's proposed, and you shouldn't meet in the middle of the day. You should be meeting at a time when people can actually attend. Our meeting requirements don't apply to emergency meetings. They don't apply to closed sessions. They don't apply to any meetings that are conducted outside of Oxnard, which could theoretically happen, but it's a rare circumstance. And sometimes you have an extenuating circumstance where you can only meet in the day. Like, for example, let's say you've got some public dignitary that is visiting the city, and they want to have a meeting with the city council, and they're only going to be available at 2 p.m. Okay, you can get a 4/5 vote of the council to say this is an extenuating circumstance and there's just no other possible way of having this meeting at a later time in the evening. You can vote to do that. So another thing that I didn't mention was that this proposal gives members of the public the same capability that the city staff does when it comes to putting out a video presentation or a PowerPoint presentation. Right now, you don't have that option. Now, some cities are just better about that. Like I've been to a meeting in Port Hueneme at a council meeting, and they allowed a member of the public to actually, give a PowerPoint presentation. I've never seen the city give that, courtesy to a member of the public. I see them do it for an applicant. I've never seen them do it for the public. And the public ought to be able to do that because, having a PowerPoint presentation can sometimes be a really good way of presenting information. And actually in Port Hueneme, they actually give you more time to speak if you have a prepared presentation like that. I think they were giving people like that like 5 minutes instead of 3. But our proposal guarantees at least 3 minutes, and it guarantees that the city will have to facilitate you if you want to give a presentation that's a PowerPoint or a slideshow presentation or a video or what have you.
Okay, so you said that under the Brown Act, or that there's state law that says that if a member, if they speak at council committees, they wouldn't have the option to speak at a regular full body of the council. Did I miss it?
If they have the opportunity to speak at a committee meeting that's made up solely of council members, the Brown Act specifically says that you don't have a right to speak at a council meeting on that agenda item. The council can prohibit that. So far, I haven't seen them do it, to their credit, but there are other cities where they have shut people down. And when I was writing this, I actually was reading one of the court cases about that, where somebody said, hey, I didn't get an opportunity to speak, I want to speak. And the judges said, no, nope, state law is pretty clear, you don't have that right. Fortunately, under the Brown Act, you have the ability to expand people's rights. They do allow you through the local initiative process to expand people's rights under the Brown Act. And that's what this measure does. It will guarantee that you have that right. It will, I guess what the city manager likes to say is that it'll institutionalize this process that they're already doing at City Hall. I'm like, okay, great. There's no harm in having a provision in the ordinance that says you have the right to speak during this type of meeting, during this type of agenda item. And the city manager acts like, well, point to an example where that's ever happened. It's like, that's not the point. The point is to institutionalize a good practice. Another good practice would be to allow people to use video, which other cities do, and actually have ordinances that allow them to do that. And we don't do that here.
Okay. At this point, I'm just going to have to take your word in regards to the Brown Act. I actually was trained in the Brown Act from the League of California Cities by actually 2 sessions just this year. And nowhere did I hear them say that you could speak at one or the other, but I'll just take your word on that and then I can go back.
So there's actually a guidebook that's put out by the, I think it's actually put out by the League of Cities that, and I'll have to look it up, where they actually mentioned that. And that was how I first got alerted to that. And then I looked up the government code and found it there and go, yeah, sure enough, it does.
Okay. Now, this will be our last question on this. Actually, a couple.
But you'll notice that the city manager never said I was wrong about that. All he said was, well, point to a time when that ever happened. He never said, Aaron's wrong. There is no law that says that. No, he knows darn well that there is such a requirement, such a portion of the government code that addresses that. During your PowerPoint slide to the INCO, there was a
small little tagline on the bottom that said that city council members would have to be trained by a certified professional in the Robert's Rules of Order.
Sure.
How many certified professionals are in the state of California?
There's hundreds all around the country, and it's not just the National Association of Parliamentarians. There's another organization. What's the name of that, Alicia? The American Institute of Parliamentarians. So I don't know how many people they have, but it's not really, really difficult to get trained in Robert's Rules or to even get certified. I mean, it takes some work. There's actually nothing that stops the city itself from having some member of staff go through the training and getting the certification, and they can handle that in-house if they so choose.
Now, it was
I mean, there are quite a few in California. I don't know how many. I know there's several in this county at least. Now, as you know, my wife is actually a professional registered parliamentarian, and she has offered on multiple occasions to provide training for free. And that offer is still open if the city ever wants to take advantage of that. And I think she actually did do some training for one of the CAGs or a group of CAGs once. Alicia, were you involved? Do you remember that?
Yeah, but they only gave me like 10 minutes.
So they didn't give her a lot of time, but at least they were open a little bit to the idea for the CAGs. But yeah, she could put on some really helpful training on how to run a meeting better. And that's what she does. I mean, she does this for some national organizations. She helps them at their conventions. So I know she cringes when she watches a city council meeting to see how poorly it's run. But if we can just get them to use Robert's Rules correctly, and it is the gold standard when it comes to meeting rules. It's been around for 144 years. It's the most widely used book of rules that you have in the United States today. And you've got years of experience. So I remember it was one instance, for example, let me tell you why Robert's Rules is important. I remember one instance where Bert Perillo tried to make an amendment to a motion on the floor. And I forget what it was about, but I think it had to do with a contract. And the city mayor shouted him down and just basically said, you can't. And that's just nonsense. Under Robert's Rules, or he has the right to make motions. He is a member of that body. He has all the rights of any other member of that body. And when a body like the city council gets training in Robert's Rules by a professional, they'll learn what their rights are. And that way you can't have a city mayor shut one person down. It would take like a 2/3 vote of the council to shut somebody down at that point, assuming time is still available on the agenda. So I've used Robert's Rules myself in various meetings. I was able to use it to my benefit during the URAP when I served on the URAP, and bring some order to that meeting and actually introduce items that otherwise wouldn't have seen the light of day. But I knew what the rules were, and I knew what my rights were. And I think everybody is benefited by knowing what the rules are and what their rights are.
You made mention that the council committees that now meet from 9 in the morning, and I believe the last one starts at 6 p.m. But prior to the Sunshine Ordinance, we actually had roughly around 15 different council committees that had 2 members on all of them. And many of them met at 9 o'clock in the morning. One in particular was the Fiscal Policy Task Force, which I had attended multiple times, that met at 9 o'clock in the morning. Your wife had also attended those meetings, and that one was actually well attended many times. Now, the Sunshine Ordinance, and please correct me if I'm wrong.
I mean, let me put it this way. I couldn't attend.
Let me just finish, because what the system used to be before, having multiple committees that were not in the council chambers, because the Fiscal Policy Task Force used to meet across the street in the HR building. No cameras to record it, so you kind of just took what the notes said. Where the Sunshine Ordinance stepped in, it condensed those 15 committees down to 4 categories. They are met in the city council chamber, so they're automatically recorded. And the city clerk is actually the one that's taking the minutes on those committee meetings. Isn't that very relatively the same system that we used to have before, when there were committee meetings that would take place around 9, 10 o'clock in the morning, when many of our residents, and as you mentioned earlier, we are a really blue collar, hardworking community that are at work during the day. I see it kind of as a benefit that all of them are condensed, so that you're not trying to pick and guess, okay, this committee meets on Wednesday, this one meets on Thursday, this one's on Tuesday. Now it's every other Tuesday.
So as I recall, there were maybe like 2 committees before that used to meet during the day that actually met. I wasn't aware of many more than that prior to the Sunshine Ordinance. But what you've got today, though, is you do have, in fact, less participation now than you did before. That's demonstrable. People ought to have an opportunity to participate. And before we were not limited in speaking time, we could actually raise hands during those meetings and ask questions, and that was fine. But that doesn't work that way anymore. I think that, while certainly the council can have their committees all they want, they just have to meet in the evenings so that people can actually participate and attend. They may need to meet in multiple evenings. Candidly, this is my candid opinion, probably different than what the city manager's opinion is, or even the council. My candid opinion is that committees for a body of only 7, pretty worthless. You want committees in place where you got a much larger body and you need several people to focus on that. But a lot of the committee meetings that I saw were just dry runs of what was going to be presented at the full council anyway. And there wasn't any real meaningful changes that were happening at the committee level for the most part. So I question their value. It seems inefficient to me. And it certainly causes there to be less public input because people can't attend during the workday. But if they want to continue to have their committee meetings, more power to them. They'll just have to meet in the evenings, and so that people can actually attend themselves and participate.
So you also may mention that with staff presentations, sometimes they could be drawn on late into the hours. And if you recall, there was many nights that we would be there till 1 o'clock in the morning. Thank God meetings aren't like that anymore, that we're there till 1 o'clock in the morning. But what happens to those individuals that are waiting for an item that cannot participate? Now, again, Sunshine Ordinance allows them 12 days before a city council meeting to provide their feedback, give their comments, but 7 days before a committee meeting. I guess I'm just trying to really figure out. I think initially my take on the Sunshine Ordinance is that I didn't like it.
I actually liked it. I actually like the Sunshine Ordinance in that it required more advance notice. I don't like that there's only 3 days notice, but they still add things at the last minute. And they don't. They're not really purely following their rules. I mean, we got something on the agenda for Tuesday that the city manager just put on, well after the 12-day requirement. So I'm not sure where it says thou shalt not follow the rules, but somehow we do that here. I mean, they actually have a list of exceptions, and like, for example, one of them was if a grant depended on it. Others have to do with some extreme extenuating circumstances. But that rule seems to be broken. So I don't understand why you'd write an ordinance and propose it as a city manager and then decide not to follow it. So it's kind of a Sunshine Ordinance, but he can cast a lot of shade whenever he wants.
All right. So we'll go ahead and move on to our last measure, which is measure N, which deals with certain standards for street repairs and maintenance, and ties in measure O, which was passed by voters back in 2008.
Yep.
One of the big things that comes up with this measure is that you believe that it was promises broken.
Yep, I do. Say that again?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the actual ordinance, it said it would protect and maintain and enhance services, and they include a list. And one of them was street repairs. Now, maybe the city had no intention ever of doing it. It was just a ploy to get people to vote for it. And I'm saying, well, that's not good enough for me. I don't think you should be allowed to use ploys to get people to vote for something. The city's using a ploy right now with Measure E. They're talking about all these services that you're going to get. They don't disclose that this is just a general tax that can be spent on any darn thing they want. They basically hoodwink people into thinking that this is a source of funds that's restricted for these purposes. It's not. And it's just candidly dishonest. And they know it. And I know it. We all know it. But what Measure N tries to do is it tries to put a little bit more accountability on City Hall for the promises they made. You know, think about it this way. If you don't, and also, this is just a basic requirement of any city, which is to, take care of their streets. I mean, if you don't do your job, what if you decide you don't want to drive a bus anymore? Should you still get paid?
I would say yes, but my employer would say something else.
That's right. Well, I mean, the reality is that, we're the voters are the employers here. And we deserve to get the service that we're paying for. And getting the streets repaired is a basic requirement of all cities, whether they have Measure O or not. So this says, fix the streets, don't care how, fix them, or we're going to put some teeth into this and say, you're going to feel a little bit of pain. And my experience is that when you put somebody in a position where it's going to be uncomfortable for them not to do their job, suddenly they're incentivized to better do their job. So our proposal says fix the streets and you get to continue to be paid. In fact, we'll even extend your contract for payment beyond the existing sunset date. We'll let you extend it 5 years at a time if you keep the streets up to an ideal level. And as you might recall from the slides that I was presenting at the forum, I show where even city staff says that they need to keep the streets up at a certain level in order to minimize the total cost of maintaining a street over its life. So by doing that, in the long run, you save money. You save a lot of money. I mean, just this idea that somehow not fixing your streets is an option, it's just bogus. You need to fix the streets. They have an obligation to do it.
I completely agree with you on that. And I'm glad you brought up your slides, because there was one slide in particular, and I'm assuming this is a quote from that actual ballot measure, but in that slide it says, quote, to protect, maintain, and enhance vital city services. Then it breaks. A next quote says increasing street paving and sidewalk and pothole repair. Now, of course, that is the thing that everybody really believes in and feels that should be occurring already.
It was from the actual ballot language.
Well, I actually have the ballot language right here, and the ballot language quote says to provide enhanced levels of vital city services, including police, fire, and emergency response, increasing street paving and sidewalk pothole repair to improve traffic flow, expanding youth recreation, after school and anti-gang prevention programs, acquiring property for parks, open space preservation, upgrading storm water drains, improving senior services, increasing building code, compliance, and other general city services.
Yep.
So because you know that Measure O was a general tax, and the language right there, again, this is directly from that ballot measure, that it clearly says that it can go for any general service for the city, and it has. Perfect example is Fire Station 8.
Mhm.
Fire Station 2, most recently with Engine 62, was saved because of Measure O. Now, going back to a comment that you just made, that you say Measure N is in place so that the city can fix the streets. And you quote, and I quote, this is what you just said, fix the streets, don't care how. Are you suggesting that the city, in order to meet the 80 PCI that you are recommending through this measure, stop paying for the other services that Measure O goes towards?
What I'm saying, well, first of all, back up a step. There's some premises you have here
Mhm.
that aren't necessarily true.
Please correct me.
Sure. So money is fungible, meaning that $1 out of your left pocket is no different than the dollar out of your right pocket. And Measure O is just a general tax. There's no such thing really as Measure O money being spent for anything, any different than saying that there's city business license money being spent for something, or property tax money being spent for something, or other sales tax revenue being spent for something. It's all general fund money. It'd be like, and there's lots of games you can play when you pretend that there is this separation. So let's say, for example, that let's say your wife let's say your wife wants to go work, and she's going to take up a job, and we're going to say, you know what, we're going to use your money from your job to pay for housing. Okay, so she goes to work, she brings home a paycheck, she puts it into a bank account, and you spend it on your mortgage payment or your rent payment. Well, guess what? You didn't actually improve your housing. You just now spending it from there. So what happens? So now the money from your job is now freed up to be spent on something else. And that's what Measure O really is. Measure O is kind of a shell game where they're going to say, oh, we spent this money on this service, so you should be happy. But what you don't see is the money that used to be spent from the rest of the general fund and is now being spent on other things, the stuff that's not so popular.
Okay, I understand what you're saying, and here's my problem with that.
So, okay.
You're comparing apples to oranges now.
Okay.
We're talking about Measure O and how it is allowed to be used for general city services.
That's right.
And now you're bringing in the general fund and saying, well, what is the general fund being spent on? Well, they're being spent on things that nobody wants to technically really look at or pay attention to.
Okay, it is apples to apples.
It's not apples to apples because in this, okay, let me back up. In the sense that they ultimately both, the general fund and Measure O, can be spent for anything. So yes, apples to apples. But this particular measure isn't talking about the general fund. It's talking about Measure O and how Measure O, you believe Measure O should be going towards paving our streets and keeping it 80.
It never says that. It really specifically doesn't say that at all. It never says how to spend the money. In fact, it specifically says that you don't have to spend the money any particular way. Because that's not what matters. What matters is if you get the job done. That's what matters. This measure says you need to meet a certain standard of performance as a city in order to collect money from us, more money from us. You need to perform. And other cities, remember, don't have a Measure O. In fact, the majority of cities don't have anything like a Measure O In California, we have 482 cities. Only 222 of those cities have something like a Measure O or some extra sales tax. The other 260 are just operating on that basic 1%. And you can go around to lots of cities in many places that seem to do a better job than Oxnard does. And the problem still is, and that was one of my other slides said, and this was from the consultant report that came out in 2020 in January, it said, regardless of what happens with this measure, the city will be required to increase funding for roads over the next 12 years. The city pretends that they don't have to do that, that somehow there's this nirvana out there where you don't have to spend money on roads, and you can spend it on all these other services. And that's just nonsense, because all that happens is it costs a lot more if you take that approach. The city on a slide back in 2017 said it would take $12.3 million a year just to maintain their roads in the bad condition they were in. And basically from like 2008 forward, the money they spent on roads actually declined. So our roads got worse, predictably. So while the city likes to play this game as if somehow, oh, you're going to require that somehow all these other services are have to go away in order to fix the roads, I got news for you. If you don't fix the roads, they're going to go away anyway. Because at some point, you got to put the money into fixing the roads. And it's just going to be a lot more. You're just borrowing from the future. You're not eliminating the expense. You're just borrowing from the future. And it's at a really, really high credit card rate of interest, in a sense, because it costs that much more to actually get the job done. So wouldn't you rather spend the money when it's cheaper to do something rather than later when it's more expensive?
No, I completely agree. I guess ultimately what I'm trying to figure out is why you're so fixated on the streets. And believe me, I want to drive on smooth streets too. I use Channel Islands Boulevard.
I'll tell you why.
Hold on. I use Channel Islands Boulevard a lot. And when they did their patchwork, that was like, I thought I was off-roading in a Honda Civic.
Right.
You just can't do that. Now it has been repaved, just like other streets have been repaved. And again, Measure O, like I just read it, that it can be used for anything. But yet you're holding it to saying that it needs to pay to maintain the road conditions.
No, what we're saying is that show us as a city that you exercise good stewardship with our money, or we stop paying you extra. That's what it really comes down to. And I love that you brought up Channel Islands Boulevard as an example, because I bet you remember that when you're driving down Channel Islands Boulevard before the city did any work on it, did you notice how it suddenly got better for like a 2-mile stretch? It's Part 1 EME. And they have the same sort of challenges that we have. And I spoke to the guy who now retired, was responsible for street paving. His name was Kit. I forget his last name at the moment. I can look it up. But he described the whole process that they went through to make sure their streets were well maintained, to the point where he even had a crew would literally walk the streets, mark up where the problems were, and they were on top of it right away. Because, you know, there's an old saying, a stitch in time saves 9. Well, it works that way with streets. And because he stayed on top of it, their streets are better than our streets, even though they suffer many of the same budget issues that we have. They certainly have the same terrain we have. They just do a darn better job of it. And the problem is with our city, we don't do a better job of it. And one of the reasons why streets are such a big issue for me is because, and why I use this as kind of like the metric for measuring stewardship, is because it's demonstrable how much more money you have to spend if you don't repair the streets. And there's actually an objective measurement in engineering for street measuring the quality of streets called a pavement condition index. So it's harder to do that with something like police protection, right? It's harder to do that with parks and other services that the city promises. There's not a whole lot of objective measurements for that. But streets are very objective, and the payback on doing a good job of your street on your streets is good. It's enormous. So that's why I'm focused on this, because I know that if we do a good job of this, then in the long run, we're going to spend less money on street repair and we're going to have more money available for other services. So that's the goal here. The goal here is to actually improve service for the city overall.
And I would just make a mention that I do recall the slides that you have shared at the INCO forum. They came directly from staff reports.
Yep.
And it was very disappointing to see those graphs. But let's also recognize that the city of Port Hueneme has roughly around 30 or, they have a small number of population of residents. They have the highest sales tax in the county at 8.75%. They're a lot smaller in size. So I think to try to compare Port Hueneme, which is probably towards the bottom of the list out of all the cities in the county, to the largest city in Ventura County, you have to kind of admit it's a little bit ridiculous. But I completely see what you're trying to say as far as trying to have a baseline for our road repair to, and I get that. We don't want to spend, and I believe the graph showed $1 now versus $8 later on. I get that. But you can see how it could be misleading that Measure N is pretty much saying that Measure O is supposed to go towards road repairs. Because those are the comments that I'm hearing from residents, that they believe that Measure O is only for road repairs because of Measure N. You can see how people got confused by that, right?
So it was the big selling point during the marketing campaign. Roads were a big issue, and roads are a big issue now. I mean, when I was doing petitioning, oh yeah, people hate the roads. It's a high priority for people in this city. It's not a high priority for people at City Hall. And the reason for that, I believe, is because money you spend on roads typically doesn't as much go into city employee salaries, whereas other services do. And given a choice, if you're a city worker, and many of our city workers don't even live in Oxnard, they'd much rather have the money in their own pocket. So this says, you know what? Enough. You need to actually give us the service that was promised and that any decent city provides. And plus, in the end, you do a good job here and you save us all a lot of money in the long run. And that's what we need to be focused on, is the long run. Unfortunately, city council members and city managers and some city employees, short run oriented. Many city managers move on to their next city pretty quickly and they don't really care.
So
Hopefully,
Aaron,
we have a city manager that wants to stick around.
you're a number guy.
Yep.
And realistically, tell me, if Measure O stopped going towards other services in the city, I guess ultimately what I'm trying to figure out, if we divert all of our funding towards maintaining the roads and the streets, what happens to the other services that is paid through Measure O?
Regardless of what happens, we need to increase spending on roads regardless. That's just, there's no fantasy world out there where you get a free road. And in the end, that road's going to cost you a lot more. So we got to stop playing this game with ourselves, that somehow that we have this option of spending all this money everywhere else. Now, there are ways of fixing your roads for less money. And there are partnerships that you can make in private industry to do that. So back, I want to say in 2016, I had a conversation with some business owners on West Star Street, which is, just off of, it's just south of Woolley, near off of Rose.
Mm-hmm.
There's a pretty good sized business park there. And I think I want to say it's like the Channel Islands Business Park or something like that, Business Association. I forget the name of it. But they're taking care of all the common areas there. So if you look at the grass and some of the other, common areas, they maintain that pretty well. And I asked, what would you think if you took over the cost of the streets and the sidewalks? They said, that sounds like a good idea because their streets at that time, I mean, it looked like Beirut during the war. Candidly, if in some cases, especially these private business parks, if you were to deed the streets to the owners of the property there, they'll get the job done better and for less money. Because here in Oxnard, if you do significant construction on streets, well, that's subject to all sorts of government rules that make it really, really expensive. You would actually be better off if you gave money back to the property owners in that business park and said, you fix the streets, you're responsible for it, and we'll keep the difference. Well, guess what? If it costs them $1 to do something where it costs the city $3, and if you can give them $1 to do the work, guess what? You save $2. And this type of approach actually can be used in many places, not just business parks. If you have neighborhoods that would want to petition to take that on in exchange for maybe a little bit of a property tax rebate or some type of tax rebate, I think many would take that on. You know how many people are upset with the lack of tree trimming? How many people are upset about the sidewalks not being repaired? If you gave them the option of owning that street, owning that sidewalk, owning that vegetation, and giving them a little bit of money back, because it's no longer in your payment condition index, right? Because that's based on public streets. Once it's in private ownership, that's no longer in the measurement. And it's a more efficient use of funds. So that would be one innovative way of approaching this. Now, you couldn't do that for the arterial roads, but you could do that for a lot of areas in town that are significant. You could do that with the alleys. The alleys have never gotten money. You might as well give those to the residents there, let them own it. They're going to do a much better job of actually maintaining it at that point because the city has never maintained it.
Okay, so
there's also grants. The city can go out and approach the state for grants. They haven't done a real good job, effective job of doing that yet. We were talked into not repealing the gas tax, but we're not really seeing much money from that.
okay, so I guess at this point we're just going to have to agree to disagree because what I'm hearing is stop paying for everything else. Stop paying for the fire station that was saved thanks to Measure O. Stop paying for other services that are being paid through Measure O, and get our roads fixed to a level that is suitable and expected by residents of Oxnard. And in your slide, you said that 80 PCI is ideal, or
Yep.
that it should be the standard.
Yep.
But
And it's not me that said it, by the way, it's the city that said that.
okay, so I stand corrected, the city then. But I think there's a lot of people out there that would disagree with not paying for certain services through Measure O, even though, again, I read the ballot measure to you right now.
It would actually make more sense. I mean, think about it this way. You saw that graph where it's $1 now versus $8 later?
Yeah.
Okay. If you knew that was going to cost you that much more, if you wait that long, it's cheaper to borrow the money now and do the repairs and pay it back over time. It's cheaper to borrow the money to fix the roads and pay it back than it is to wait until they decay to the point where it's gravel. And if you take that approach, then you can bring in other reforms in the meantime that will increase revenues. That's why Measure F is so important. That's why Measure L is so important. So we get the transparency so we can know that the money's being spent better. All the reforms that we have as a package here are a much better alternative than Measure E. Measure E is basically the city manager likes to talk about the past versus the future. Let me tell you what the past is. The past is continuing to do what you're doing now, being married to that approach, and all we're going to do is just raise the cost of doing it. We're going to make you pay more for not even enhanced services. Even the city manager says, I'm not going to enhance your services. I'm just going to restore them, as if somehow that's this great accomplishment. You're going to pay a lot more money for the basics. Well, that's not exactly a winning argument with me. I worked for a company where we had a division that wasn't performing well. And we said to them, we're not going to put any more money into your division beyond this X dollar amount. And you know what? If you don't fix it, if you don't fix your problem, it's going to be a lot of hurt for you. Well, what they did is they were good managers. They realized that just asking for more money wasn't going to be the solution to the problem. And they figured it out. They said, oh, well, we can figure out a new way of reducing costs here. We can figure out a new way to bring in more revenues there. And they stepped up to the plate. Now, hopefully this city manager can step up to the plate. When a city manager says that my only option is to double the city imposed portion of the sales tax to make it the highest city imposed tax rate in the state. That's my only solution to give you basic services that isn't even beyond the basics. We have a 1.5% tax right now imposed by the city. You've got 260 cities in California that only charge 1%. We already charge 50% more. He wants to increase it by another 1.5%, which brings it to 3%. There are only 2 cities in the entire state that charge 3%. And that tells you right there that if he thinks he needs to raise the tax rate to match the highest rate in the entire state in order to just provide us with the basics, and he's already told us what he wants to spend the money on. He has said publicly, hey, the big cost of any city is the salaries we pay. And I need to pay a lot more in salaries to keep people, because otherwise we'll have bad people. Well, he's pretty much admitted that he doesn't really know how to manage his money well. He doesn't know how to manage it. I expect a manager to figure out innovative ways to spend less to get more. He is actually promising you that he wants to spend more for less. He is absolutely telling us that. And that's just not acceptable in my world. And it doesn't seem to be acceptable in most cities in this state. But for some reason, Oxnard is in this privileged position where we have to pay the highest city sales tax in the state just to get poor service.
So Aaron, let me ask you, because
taxpayers don't want to be a sugar daddy here, and that's what they're being asked to do.
Well, look, I'll be the first one to say, I'm not in favor of doing more taxes. I really am not. But I have to see long term. I guess the final comment or question that I'm going to ask you, and I hope you answer this, is what do you say to those hundreds of residents that showed up at the council's chambers during budget, begging for fire station number 2 to remain open and for other services throughout the city to remain open, and the council ultimately going against the recommendation of the city manager and using Measure O to pay for those services? What do you tell them that you, and I quote, fix the streets, don't care how, prefer that Measure O goes towards street repairs and maintenance and potholes and alleyways versus a fire station and other services in the city? What do you say to those people?
Well, part of that is important. The rest of it's kind of your elaboration on that.
Of course.
What I'm telling people is that Fixing the roads is a good investment for your money. It saves you money in the long run. You'll have more money available for other services in the long run if you do that. If you don't, you're going to have to pay much, much more, and wind up not getting services. Remember, before 2008, we didn't have a Measure O. Somehow we ran a city. Somehow we provide services. Since then, we've adopted Measure O. We still can't take care of our city. And my prediction is that if we pass Measure E, at some point in the future, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, who knows, we're going to be back right where we started, saying, you know what, we can't manage our money, we need more. So we live in a world where, I want to get back to the folks who were at the council meeting that you were mentioning. Resources are scarce. Human beings have unlimited wants, and we have scarce resources. And there's always a cost when you buy anything. When you purchase one service, you're gonna have to, at least in the short run, you have to look at what you're giving up. There's no such thing as free. If you pay more taxes, that comes at a cost. That means less money in your pocket to spend on other things in your life, right? If you have a few $100s extra per year that you're spending now, well, that's Christmas presents that you're not buying for your kids, maybe. So one way or another, budgets are going to be impacted. Either it's going to be the city's budgets or people's personal budgets. But there's no such thing as free in this world. Now, the good news is that when you put an organization under a little bit of stress and you say, find a solution, I've seen time and time again where managers figure out solutions. Other cities during the Great Recession, we went into the Great Recession suddenly with this extra half-cent sales tax. Other cities didn't. And what they did is other cities restructured their operations. They figured out ways to get rid of deadwood and perform, and they came out of that recession better than we did because we had this quote unquote lifeline. So, there were many there for the PAC, for example, during that meeting. And because of pressure, the city manager figured out, hey, let's contract it out. That was a change where he found a way to address that because he had pressure, because he didn't have unlimited monies. And you can have a better outcome that way. We need to look at some big service costs here in this city and ask ourselves, is there a better way to do it? I'm really interested in what it costs for public safety, for particularly police.
Okay.
I want to know why the sheriff is able to provide services at less cost than we do. I want to know that. What's their?
You know that for sure that the sheriffs are costing less because you just said that you wanted to see what PD is costing.
I didn't hear some of that. Say again.
You just said that the sheriffs are providing service at a lower cost.
Yep.
But just before that, you just made a mention that you are curious to see what PD's cost is. So
what I said, I'm curious how they're managing to perform that service at less cost. So for example,
okay.
So I used 4 cities as a comparison. 2 of them have their own police departments. 2 of them are run by the sheriff. So Camarillo and Thousand Oaks. So Thousand Oaks has the lowest cost per capita, $252, $253 per person. Camarillo is next up at about $281 per capita. Now go to the police departments. Then you got Simi Valley with a police department. That's $292. Go to Port Hueneme, it's $311. So what does it cost in Oxnard? So in Oxnard, we're not completely sure because Oxnard has both police and fire, and their financial statements don't break it out perfectly. But I can tell you this much, that police and fire combined in Oxnard is like $525 per capita. And I can tell you that roughly, and I'm going to be off by some amount, I don't know how much, But we know that roughly about 3/4 of that cost is police and about 1/4 of it is fire. And maybe I'm off a little bit. Maybe it's 70% police. Maybe it's 80% police. I'm not sure. But whatever that number is, if it's 75, if I say 75% of that $525 per capita is police, well, that brings us to a cost of police of about $393 per capita. Compare that to Port Hueneme at $311. Compare that at Simi Valley at $292. Compare that with Camarillo at $280. Compare that to Thousand Oaks at $253. Big differences, right? We should understand why, because that's tens of millions of dollars a year.
Well, you know what, Aaron? I would actually say that if you are going to be comparing cities, that you compare cities that are similar to Oxnard. You're using Port Hueneme, which is a city of roughly 60,000 people, Camarillo of another like 65,000 people.
So let's talk about Port Hueneme.
Thousand Oaks that has about 127,000 people. Simi Valley, the same, roughly around 125,000.
Yep.
And you're comparing it to the city of Oxnard that has over 208,000 residents.
You got it. So why should it cost
smaller property value versus two of those cities that you mentioned? That you, at that point, you have to agree that you're comparing apples to oranges.
So
now,
hold on.
a city that was the exact same size as us, then I would be a little bit more inclined to that. But you're comparing cities that have a smaller population and higher property tax.
So let me make my case. Look at Port Hueneme. Now, Port Hueneme is a smaller city. What is Port Hueneme? So why should Port Hueneme cost more, or why should Port Hueneme cost less than Oxnard? Because Port Hueneme, for example, you got a police chief, right? We got a bigger city. You're able to spread more costs when you have a bigger city. Typically, when you have a bigger city, you've got economies, or any bigger operation, you often have economies of scale. I mean, if you had a city of only 10 people in it and one of them was a criminal, police protection might be pretty expensive there, much more than here. But because you got, as a city gets bigger, typically, as any enterprise gets bigger, you have certain economies of scale. You would think that Oxnard would figure out a way with its own police department to be able to provide service for less than Port Hueneme does, because they can spread the overhead better than Port Hueneme does. But I still think it's worth asking the question, and here's my problem. My biggest issue, and I don't have a conclusion yet, my biggest issue is that no one's asking the question. Why is it unfair? Why is it unfair to ask the question, why does it cost less here? Why is it unfair to go and say, let's talk to these people. Let's find out what they're doing. Maybe they figured out something that we haven't done. Why is it that we always have to say, gosh, we can only look at ourselves? I like comparisons, especially when the comparisons, especially when those comparisons are where people are doing much better than us. I don't like averages of other cities. I want to find out who's the best. And I want to see who we can mimic. Now, are we going to achieve what they've achieved? Maybe not. But I'd like to get closer to where they are than where we are now. I'm not willing to say that there's no solution other than raising our costs. I don't accept that. I think that when you're not willing to self-examine and compare to other cities and ask questions, well, you're doing your constituents a disfavor. And one of the reasons why I'm running for council is because I want to at least put in that perspective. Because right now, who do you have on the council? They're good people. Okay, we got a couple school teachers. School teachers are great. You got a retired postal worker. Postal workers are fine. You got a Social Security disability insurance attorney. You have a current city employee. You got a retired city employee. You have a state government worker. Who among them has business experience? None of them. So what I want to do, and look at how they vote. I mean, 93% of the votes in the last 2 years are unanimous. I think about 99% of the time, whatever the city manager proposed pretty much was adopted. I want somebody there who's going to ask the questions I'm asking. And that doesn't mean that folks are going to see things my way. But I think that if I can ask a few intelligent questions, then at least we'll have some self-examination what we're doing. And maybe there's other solutions other than just raising taxes, which we wanted to raise taxes here to be the highest in the state, apparently. I don't understand that. I don't understand why that's seen as the first solution. I haven't seen anybody ask questions about why other cities can do it better and how they can do it for less. I just don't see those questions being answered. And I don't see why somebody should be offended that those questions are being asked now.
You know, Aaron, I will go ahead and say that you're right in the sense that those questions should be asked. I will also say that I completely agree with you that we should compare to other cities. But I also believe that we need to compare ourselves to cities that are equal in size or relatively equal in size, so that we actually have a fighting chance to determine where we're at. Comparing us to smaller cities, I don't believe is appropriate. But hey, I got what you said, that you try to compare our city to cities that are performing well. I also heard you not answer the question in regards to what do you say to those residents that fought to try to save a fire station and other services in the city. And that's perfectly fine. You don't want to answer, that's fine. Your comment was our city deserves to have roads and other cities are performing the job without any issues, without any other taxes. That's perfectly fine. You don't want to answer that question. Understand that when you get into the public light, you have to be able to respond to those. And again, your quote of saying fix the streets no matter what, you don't care how they're fixed. Again, Measure O goes to a lot more services than just streets.
But remember,
No,
the money's fungible. You know, we keep talking about Measure O money as if it's some separate pot of money. It's not.
And I get that. It is not a separate pot of money, but at the exact same time, you are saying take Measure O money and fix the streets, sidewalks, potholes, and alleys. You keep
not what I'm saying. You keep saying that, and that's not what I'm saying.
To the INTO clearly said that.
No, what I'm saying is
Measure O needs to meet certain standards when it comes to streets. Otherwise, Measure O sunsets before what the voters voted on to sunset. And that if the city meets those certain standards that you are outlining in your measure, they get to extend it another 5 years to an increments of 5 years, I believe up to 15 years.
No, actually, it's an unlimited number of 5-year increments.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
But Measure O doesn't dictate how you spend money.
Okay.
Or rather, I'm sorry, Measure N doesn't dictate how you spend money. It doesn't do any such thing. It simply says the city needs to be a good steward of our money. They need to fix our roads. And if they fix their roads, then they're entitled. They've earned the money that they're charging us. I just want them to earn the money, just like you do.
You realize that you just said they have to fix the roads. Come on. Yes. Okay, Aaron. All right.
All right. We're going to talk in circles probably, but I believe that the long-term option is bring in more businesses into town. So you can bring in more property taxes and sales taxes and business license taxes. Make it easier for us to see where the money is being spent so that the money is spent more efficiently. Create more transparency and accountability. These are the sort of things that allow you to run an operation more efficiently. And you can get more bang for the buck. In my world, you get more bang for the buck. At City Hall's world, they don't. They don't get more bang for the buck. So that's my main thing. My main thing is put out a better operation. I mean, maybe you're happy with the status quo.
Well,
I'm not.
let's not go there. Let's not insinuate what either one of us likes something, because I have been an advocate for my community of South Oxnard since I got involved in the city government. And it has always been to fix our roads, bring jobs, address the many issues in our city. And after learning more about our city, I understand where the general fund goes towards, and I understand what Measure O money goes towards. Measure O goes into that general fund, and it is used for whatever services that we need and has been used for whatever services. But you're right, we're not going to go round in circles for this. So I will give you your final comments.
I do want to leave you with something, though.
These are your final comments. Go right ahead, because it's time to start wrapping it up.
Absolutely. And we've gone way over our budgeted time,
Yes,
but it was a great conversation, by the way. So basically there's a difference between activity and productivity. Activity is just when you just move about, but you don't actually really get anything accomplished. And I find that when you can manage well, you convert activity into something that's productive. And spending money doesn't translate into output. Spending money is an input into a process, but it doesn't result in anything useful unless the money is well directed. If you suddenly pay all of your employees double what they get now, you're not going to say that you spent double on public service. No, we're going to say that you spent double to get the same amount of public service you got before. You need to actually be efficient with the money you spend. And because there's no accountability at City Hall, and there's no even real attempts to measure accountability at City Hall, where we're going to find ourselves in the not too distant future is that if we adopt Measure E, we're going to be back at the table 10 years from now, 15 years from now, saying it's not working out and we need more money. And at some point, you got to have some compassion for the folks that are actually paying the bills. And I do. I want people to get their money's worth. I don't think they get their money's worth. That's the main thing. I think we deserve to get more for our money. City Hall has a different opinion. I understand why. I have a different opinion. My opinion is we need more. We need to get more for less. I've seen other operations accomplish that. I'm confident the city can do that too, but they need to be put into a position where that's the choice on the table. Once the choice on the table is either get a lot more efficient or it's going to be a bad situation for me, people step up to the plate and they perform really well. I've seen that time and time again over the years. So I say, put the city in the position where they need to perform. And I think they will.
All right, Aaron, like you made mention, we did go over our allotted time. I felt that the conversation was good, well done between us. So thank you for joining me in this conversation about, one, your candidacy, what you hope to see as an elected official one day, and the measures that you authored and a proponent of, measures F, L, M, and N. So thank you for joining me tonight on this. Thank you for that.
And thank you. It was fun. You're a great host. You did a great job.
Thank you.
All right.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Oxnard Live. Please be sure to join us this Thursday as we have Ronald Arejo, which is a candidate for District number 3, and Lucy Cartagena, who is a candidate for District 4. Both will be talking about what motivated them to run for office and what their plans are for moving our city forward. Once again, this is Aaron Starr, candidate for District 3, as well as the proponent and author of the 4 measures, Measure F, M, L, and N. Probably said those out of order. But to learn more, you can visit his website, movingoxnardforward.com or .org. .org. And you can learn more about those measures and him, or actually your website, starforoxnard.com, correct?
Correct.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is Oxnard Live, all live and 100% real. Please be sure to join us this Thursday for another round of candidate interviews, as well as a special edition of Oxnard Live on Friday, October 9th at 6 p.m. as we have candidate for County Supervisor District 5, Carmen Ramirez, join us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching and being with us during this special edition of Oxnard Live as we speak with candidate and author of the measures and candidate of District 3, Aaron Starr. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, Daniel. You were great.